On the rooftop of a glass tower 18 floors above Portland, a helicopter sat waiting, fueled, ready, blades still. And Sandra Weston was out of options. The meeting was in 90 minutes, $11 million. Gone if she didn't move right now. Her team had made 15 calls. 15.
Not one
Every
answer.
pilot in the city either unavailable, suspended, or delivering a baby somewhere inconvenient. Then the stairwell door opened, gray uniform. A mop. A man no one had ever bothered to learn the name of. He looked at the helicopter, then at her, and said with the absolute calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times in conditions she couldn't imagine, "I can fly it." The laughter came fast, loud, the kind meant to humiliate. Sandra didn't laugh. She looked at his hands, at the way he stood, at something in his eyes that had no business being in the eyes of a man pushing a cleaning cart, something quiet, and certain, and very, very old. She said something then, 4 words she could not explain and would not take back. And he walked toward the helicopter without hesitating once. The rooftop was 18 floors above Portland. That detail mattered to Sandra Weston more than it probably should have. Because from up here, the city looked manageable, organized. Every building in its place, every street running where it was supposed to run, every variable accounted for. She'd spent most of her adult life trying to make the ground level look the same way. Neat, controlled, nothing left to chance. The Bell 407 sat 20 feet away, blades still, fuel tank full, keys already in the ignition. A paper coffee cup sat in the center console, some ground crew member's forgotten errand from the pre-flight check, and it hadn't been touched. Small detail. Irrelevant, probably. She noticed it anyway. The way she noticed everything that didn't belong where it was. And there was no one to fly the helicopter. Sandra checked her watch. 8:51. The meeting with Callahan Industries was at 10:30 across the city. Robert Callahan's office. Handshakes, signatures, $11 million, shifting from possibility into reality. She'd spent 4 months building this deal. 4 months of calls and revised proposals and dinners where she smiled until her face ached. The contract was drafted. The lawyers had signed off. All that remained was showing up. Except her pilot was in a hospital right now with a fractured wrist. Phil Garrett had called at 8:43 from Providence Medical. His voice somewhere between apologetic and mortified, explaining that a pickup truck had rear-ended him on the Burnside Bridge on his way in. Minor accident, except for the wrist. Which was not minor when your job involved holding a cyclic for 12 minutes over Portland airspace. Sandra had thanked him, genuinely, then hung up and stood in her office for exactly 3 seconds. Before calling Timothy Reed. Timothy was 24 years old and handled logistics for Western Aviation with the frantic efficiency of someone who understood that his job security depended on solving problems before Sandra had to think about them twice. He was already on the phone before she finished her sentence. That was 9 minutes ago. Now he stood 6 feet away on the rooftop, phone pressed to his ear, the color draining steadily from his face. Donna Hayes stood on Sandra's other side, tablet in hand, working a different list of contacts with the methodical determination of someone who had been doing this long enough to know when a situation was unsolvable and chose to keep working anyway. The wind off the Willamette came in short, cold bursts. Sandra's hair pulled loose from the knot at the back of her neck. She didn't fix it. Every charter in Portland is either booked or can't mobilize in time, Timothy said, lowering his phone. His voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering news they'd rather not deliver. The backup on retainer, his wife went into labor last night. Third option had his certificate flagged last week. FAA administrative hold. He can't fly commercially until it clears. Donna didn't look up from her tablet. I have 2 more calls out. We're past calls, Sandra said. Donna looked up. We need a pilot in the next 20 minutes or we drive. Sandra turned back to the helicopter. And if we drive, we're 40 minutes late on a good traffic day. Today is not a good traffic day, neither of them argued. Because she was right. And because Sandra Weston being right about things was not a new development in either of their professional lives, she walked to the edge of the rooftop instead, looked out at the city below, the Willamette running dark and calm, the bridges crossing it one after another like stitches, the West Hills green against a sky that had no business being this clear in October. $11 million. Not just the number, what the number meant. Western Aviation had operated at a certain altitude for 22 years, regional, respected, steady. Her father had built something real, something that lasted. But steady wasn't the same as growing. The Callahan contract would change the company's trajectory in ways that compounded over years. New routes, new partnerships, the kind of deal that other deals followed. Her father knew that, which was why he'd called her every Monday for 6 months asking about it. George Weston was 71 years old and had suffered a mild cardiac event 2 years ago that his cardiologist had quietly described as a warning shot across the bow. He'd stepped back from daily operations, which meant he'd moved his office from the 14th floor to his house in Lake Oswego and continued running the company from there. Just without having to wear a tie. He'd handed Sandra the keys with a statement she still wasn't entirely sure was a compliment. "You have 6 months to prove the board wrong about you." She'd taken that personally, which was probably what he intended. The Monday calls continued. The quarterly reports went to his house. He had opinions about every decision she made, which he delivered through carefully worded emails that used the word suggest as a thin veil over the word insist. This deal was the one that would make the calls stop, or at least change their tone. "Nothing," Donna said, setting her tablet down. "I've called everyone on both lists. We're out of options." Sandra turned from the edge. "We could ask Callahan to push it an hour," Timothy offered. "Explain there was a logistics issue." The look Sandra gave him was not unkind. It was simply conclusive. "Robert Callahan flew in from Chicago this morning," she said. "He has a board meeting at 2 o'clock. He told us in the last call that this was the only window. We asked to push it. We're telling him we couldn't handle a logistics problem on the most important morning of this deal." She paused. "And then we don't get a second call." Timothy nodded. Looked at his shoes. The rooftop fell into a silence that had weight in it, not the absence of sound, because the city was always present 18 floors below, always humming and moving and pressing upward. The silence of a situation that had run out of moves. And that was when the door to the stairwell opened. He came out carrying a mop, actually carrying a mop, the yellow bucket on wheels rolling behind him, the unhurried quality of someone who has a task list and is working through it without drama.
Gray unit.
The kind of gray designed to disappear, functional, institutional, the color of background. He had short dark hair, a face that had been out in weather, and the way he moved was not slow exactly, deliberate. Like someone who had learned not to spend energy on anything that didn't require it. He stopped when he saw 3 people standing on the rooftop, looking at a helicopter. Sandra recognized him the way she recognized most of the building's maintenance staff imperfectly, through the fuzzy lens of someone who saw the same gray uniforms every day without ever quite resolving them into individual people. He was one of the evening crew. She'd seen him in the executive hallway before, once near the simulator room, once in the lobby, late with a small child on his shoulders. She'd never learned his name. He took in the scene with the stillness of someone processing information before deciding whether to act on it. Then he spoke, "I can fly it," 3 words. Completely flat. No audition quality. No attempt to sell anything. Just a statement of fact, laid down like a tool on a workbench. Donna's laugh came out before she could stop it, loud, involuntary, the kind that echoes off rooftop concrete. Her hand went to her mouth after the fact, which didn't help. Timothy made a sound somewhere between a cough and a chuckle, the noise of someone who isn't sure if laughing is appropriate but can't quite help it either. The man in the gray uniform didn't react. He stood there with the mop handle in one hand and looked at Sandra with the steady patience of someone who has been underestimated before and found it neither surprising nor worth addressing. Sandra looked at him, really looked. Which was different from seeing. He wasn't fidgeting. Wasn't performing confidence the way people performed it when they were bluffing the slightly too bright eyes. The chin lifted a degree higher than necessary. He was just standing. Hands easy, weight balanced, the mop handle held loosely, like he'd forgotten he was carrying it. There was something in his face she couldn't immediately name. The closest she got was settled, the quality of a person who has been through something that rearranged everything inside and has made a kind of peace with the new geography. "You're telling me you can fly a Bell 407, Sandra said. "Not a question. A test?" "Yes, ma'am." "Commercial certificate?" "FAA commercial rotorcraft." "Current." Donna's expression became the face of a woman watching her boss consider stepping off a perfectly good building. "Sandra, how long have you been flying?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. First solo was 19 years ago. Military rotary wing after that. 8 years. Military, that landed differently than she expected. Sandra looked at him again with that information overlaid, and something she'd noticed about him, without knowing what she was noticing, the stillness, the economy of movement, the complete absence of self-consciousness, clicked into a different shape. The helicopter sat there, fueled, ready. Useless without someone qualified to put hands on it. The clock in her head that had been running since 8:43 ticked forward another 30 seconds, and Sandra Weston, who ran a company, who managed a board, who had spent 2 years making decisions she justified to her father every Monday morning, said the most inexplicable things she had ever said in a professional context. The words came out before she'd cleared them, before she'd reviewed them, before she'd done any of the deliberate processing she applied to everything else in her life. "Fly this, and I'll marry you." Complete silence. Donna's tablet slipped. She caught it. Timothy made a noise like a man who had briefly forgotten how breathing worked. The man in the gray uniform blinked once. That was his entire reaction. One blink. Not amusement. Not shock. Not the complicated expression of someone trying to figure out if this was a joke and how to respond to a joke. Just one blink, like someone recalibrating slightly. Then he set the mop against the wall. Sandra watched him walk to the helicopter, with a feeling she couldn't name something close to the sensation of having said something into a phone, and realized halfway through the sentence it was going to the wrong person. Except she'd meant it as a joke. Obviously, probably. She watched him do the pre-flight check, not a cursory glance and go. An actual check, systematic, starting at the tail rotor, working forward along the fuselage. Checking the main rotor hub with his hands as well as his eyes, crouching to examine the skids. He moved around the aircraft the way a doctor moved around a patient, purposeful, unhurried, each step connected to the one before it. He climbed into the pilot seat. Left hand on the collective, right on the C-click. Eyes moving across the instrument panel in a sequence so practiced it had become unconscious, the kind of scan that happens below the level of thought. He glanced at the paper coffee cup in the center console, noted it and left it exactly where it was. The engine caught low at first, then building the deep mechanical heartbeat of a turbine engine, coming to life. The rotor blades beginning their slow revolution, 1 rotation, 2, the sound deepening as they picked up speed, and the air beneath them started to do what air does when a rotor moves through it fast enough. Donna grabbed Sandra's arm. "You are not getting in that." Sandra removed her arm from Donna's grip. She crossed to the helicopter, climbed into the co-pilot's seat, buckled in, put the headset on. His voice came through the headset immediately clear, measured, the kind of radio voice trained into people who spend years communicating over noise and static. "Ready?" Sandra's hands were on the armrests. Her heart rate was doing something she chose not to acknowledge. "Let's go." The helicopter lifted. Not the way she'd expected, some lurching, grinding negotiation with gravity. Smooth, definitively smooth. The rooftop fell away beneath them with a gentleness that was almost shocking, and Portland spread out below, in that way it only looked from altitude. The grid of it, the logic of it, the river cutting through everything. Donna and Timothy were two small figures on the rooftop. Growing smaller, Sandra looked at the man beside her instead. His hands moved in small, precise adjustments. Not corrections, there was nothing wrong to correct. Refinements. The constant conversation between a pilot and an aircraft, the dialogue of pressure and response that looks like stillness from the outside, but is in fact continuous work. He banked left over the Pearl District, threading into the air traffic corridor above the city with the confidence of someone who had navigated tighter airspace in conditions considerably worse than a clear October morning. He wasn't performing. He was. That was the thing. There was no awareness of audience, no slight elevation in posture that said, "Watch this." He was simply flying, the way people did things they had done for so long. The skill had gone somewhere deeper than conscious action. Sandra had been around aviation her entire life. Her father had put her in the co-pilot seat of a Cessna at age 7. She knew what good looked like. She knew the difference between proficiency and mastery. This was mastery. "Where did you learn to fly?" The question came out quieter than she intended. He didn't look at her. Eyes on the horizon, on the airspace, on the city laid out below like a map of itself. "I used to do this for a living. Not elaboration, not a story. Just the edge of one, offered without invitation and with no expectation that she'd know what to do with it." She didn't push. 12 minutes after leaving the Western Aviation rooftop, the helicopter descended toward the landing pad on the east side of the Callahan Industries complex. The approach was unhurried, methodical. Each reduction in altitude so gradual it was almost imperceptible, until suddenly they were 5 feet off the ground, then 2. Then the skids settled onto the concrete with a contact so light that the forgotten coffee cup in the center console hadn't moved an inch. He powered down, removed his headset, set it on the instrument panel with the same economy of motion he applied to everything. Sandra sat hands still on the armrests, the engine cooling around them. Outside, she could see 2 Callahan representatives in suit jackets waiting at the edge of the pad, $11 million. Waiting, she unbuckled, reached for the door. "Stopped. Who are you?" It came out before she could make it sound like less than what it was. Genuine, urgent, the question of someone who had just witnessed something that didn't fit any category she had ready. He was looking at the instrument panel. Something in his jaw shifted slightly. Then he looked at her, and his expression had the quality of a door that opens only far enough to show you it exists before closing again. "Someone who used to matter," he said, quietly, with the complete absence of self-pity that made it harder to hear than if there had been any. Then he looked back at the panel. Sandra climbed out, straightened her jacket, walked across the landing pad toward the Callahan representatives, with her hand already extending, her face already arranged into the expression that said, "I'm here, I'm ready. Let's talk about $11 million. Behind her, she heard the helicopter door close. She did not look back, because looking back was not something she allowed herself. Not professionally, not personally. She had built that rule into herself so thoroughly over 2 years that it had become structural load-bearing, the kind of habit you couldn't remove, without checking what else depended on it. She walked through the glass doors of Callahan Industries. She shook Robert Callahan's hand. She sat down at the table and spent the next 63 minutes being exactly who she needed to be. The contract signing happened at 11:47. Callahan's fountain pen, Western Aviation's legal team Seam's signature block, $11 million, formalized into 42 pages of binding agreement. Callahan was generous in his assessment of the meeting, called it a new chapter, used the word partnership 3 times, which was his tell for genuine enthusiasm. Sandra smiled, said the right things, meant more of them than she expected. When she stepped back outside at 12:14, the landing pad was empty. The helicopter was there. He wasn't. She stood on the pad for a moment, with the signed contract in her bag and the autumn sun hitting the concrete at a low angle, and the feeling of a victory that should have felt cleaner than it did. He had taken a bus back. She found this out later from Timothy, who'd called down to check, who'd learned from building security that the man had signed out at 10:49, waited for the 14 line on Macadam Avenue, and ridden it back to the office, like a man returning from any other errand. Ryan Mercer. That was the name in the security log. That was the name on the employee badge that security had scanned at 6:02 that evening when he came back for his regular shift. That was the name she typed into the FAA Civil Aviation Registry. At 9:17 that night, sitting alone at her desk on the 14th floor of a building her father had put his name on, the Portland skyline going dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Ryan Mercer. Certificate type, airline transport pilot rotorcraft, helicopter. Issue date, 08/1/2019. Expiration, 08/31/2027. Status, cranking. She stared at that word for a moment. Current, not a lapsed certificate, not something grandfathered or provisional. He had renewed it actively, deliberately, through whatever had brought him to a grey uniform and a mop and a night shift at an aviation company where nobody knew his name. Maintaining an ATP certificate required medical exams, currency requirements, ongoing documentation. This wasn't accidental. Someone had made a decision, at regular intervals, to keep a door open they apparently had no intention of walking through. She opened a new tab. Typed his name into the search bar. The results were sparse. His digital footprint was the footprint of someone who had stopped generating one at a specific point in time. Before that point, a handful of scattered hits. After it, nothing. The social media profiles that existed were years dormant. The last posts from 2021 consisting entirely of reshared content, no original words, but there was one result from a news archive. The Oregonian. October 2020, Oregon soldier among honored at Fort Lewis ceremony. She clicked. The photo was small and slightly grainy in the way of newspaper photos digitized from print. A formal ceremony. Men and women in dress uniform arranged with military precision. In the second row, a face she recognized, younger. Sharper around the edges, not thinner, but less worn. The same dark hair, the same straight posture, standing completely still, in the way people stood completely still when something official was happening, and they had been trained to perform stillness as a professional discipline. A general was pinning something to his chest. She read the caption first, then the article. Captain Ryan Mercer, 30, of Portland, received the Medal of Valor Friday for actions during a combat search and rescue operation during his second overseas deployment. Mercer, a UH-60 Black Hawk pilot with 8 years of military rotary wing experience, executed a night extraction under sustained hostile fire, successfully recovering 6 personnel from a compromised position after the designated extraction aircraft was disabled. Co-pilot Corporal Thomas Briggs, 26, of Medford, Oregon, sustained significant injuries during the operation and was medically separated from service. She stopped. Read that paragraph again. Co-pilot Corporal Thomas Briggs, 26, of Medford, Oregon, sustained significant injuries during the operation and was medically separated from service. She knew what medically separated meant in this context. She'd spent enough time around veterans who cycled through aviation careers to understand the language. Thomas Briggs was 26 years old, and he had come home from that operation, and he had not come home whole. And Ryan Mercer had a medal. Sandra sat back in her chair. Looked at the ceiling for a moment, the textured corporate ceiling of her 14th floor office. The building her father had put his name on, the company she was running at 29 because the alternative was watching it drift without direction, while her father recovered, and the board got nervous. She looked back at the screen. Typed his name again with a different set of search terms. The second result was also from the Oregonian. October 2021, significantly shorter. The kind of item that ran in the local section on a Tuesday, a few column inches that the paper gave to the small private ceremonies of grief. Laura Ann Mercer, 28, of Portland, passed away October 14th following a traffic accident on Highway 26. A dedicated third-grade teacher at Chapman Elementary School, Laura is survived by her husband, Captain Ryan Mercer, and their son, Sandra, read it twice, October 14th, 2021, which meant that Ryan Mercer had been overseas on his second deployment, the one that ended with a medal and a co-pilot in a wheelchair. When his wife died on a highway outside Portland in the rain, she looked up the date of the Fort Lewis ceremony, October 2020. A full year earlier, the timeline assembled itself without her wanting it to. Ryan deployed. Ryan flew the extraction. Thomas Briggs lost the use of his legs. Ryan came home with a medal and the unresolvable weight of a decision that went right according to every metric except the ones that kept him awake. And then a year later, while he was back overseas, Laura died on Highway 26, and their son, survived by her husband, Captain Ryan Mercer, and their son, no name given for the son. Children often weren't named in these notices. Sandra found herself unreasonably bothered by the absence of a name, by the small boy reduced to their son, as though grief had already begun the process of erasing the specific details. She opened the HR system, typed in the badge number from security's log, Ryan Mercer. Position, facilities janitorial evening shift, hired, January 14, 2023, 2 years ago, almost to the week. Emergency contact, Cole Mercer. Son, C.A. Margaret Briggs. Portland, Margaret Briggs. She's read that twice. The emergency contact for Ryan Mercer's son carried the last name Briggs. Whether that was coincidence or something more deliberate, Sandra couldn't tell from a database entry, but the idea of it, Ryan Mercer listing as the person to call if something happened to him, a woman who might be connected to the co-pilot, who'd come home in a wheelchair, did something uncomfortable to the space behind her sternum. It suggested a web of connection and obligation that she was only seeing the edge of. She closed the HR system, closed the browser. She sat for a while in the quiet of her office, with the contract in her bag, and $11 million secured, and the Callahan deal finally real after 4 months of work. And the only thing she could think about was the way Ryan Mercer had said. Someone, Ryan, who used to matter with that complete absence of performance, that complete lack of invitation for her, to argue with him about it. Not fishing, not hoping to be contradicted. Just a man stating a thing he believed to be true. The way people stated facts about weather or distance or time, she thought about the pre-flight check. The way he'd touched the rotor hub with both hands. The way the landing had been so gentle, it was almost an apology for disturbing the concrete. She thought about the mop handle. The way he'd set it against the wall and walked toward the helicopter, like someone returning to a room they'd left long ago. And weren't sure they had the right to re-enter. She picked up her phone, considered calling her father. Put it down, considered calling the company's aviation consultant who handled background screening. Put that down too. What she'd found was public record. What she'd understood from it was hers. And what she intended to do with it was something she hadn't worked out yet. Sitting alone on the 14th floor at 9:47 on a Wednesday night, with rain beginning to streak the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city going soft and blurred beyond them, she turned the light off, sat in the dark for 13 minutes before she finally gathered her things. She locked her office, rode the elevator down, walked through the lobby past the scale model of the vintage propeller plane, in its glass case, the one that a small child had apparently touched once, months ago, prompting a lecture from Donna that Sandra had witnessed without intervening, because she'd had somewhere to be and told herself the situation was handled. She stopped, looked at the model. She thought about the small figure with the notebook, the gray uniform. A man who'd said, "I'm sorry," and taken his son's hand and left without making it anyone else's problem. She hadn't said anything. She'd walked past. She walked past now too. Different feeling this time. Same action, some things took longer than 13 minutes to resolve. Ryan Mercer had a system for Tuesday nights. Cole went to bed at 8:30. The apartment on Southeast Hawthorne was 2 bedrooms and loud in the way of buildings that had been converted from something else, and never quite finished the conversion pipes that expressed opinions. A neighbor above, who apparently rearranged furniture at midnight, a radiator that functioned as percussion accompaniment to the first cold hour of every shift. Ryan had stopped hearing most of it. The noise had become the texture of home, which was what happened when you stayed somewhere long enough and stopped comparing it to other places. 8:30, Cole slept. 9 o'clock, Ryan left for Western Aviation. The building was a 20-minute bus ride from the apartment, which meant he arrived at 9:22 most nights, signed in, collected his cart, and started on the executive wing. 14th floor first, working down. Margaret Briggs, Tommy's mother, who had become in the past 2 years the closest thing Cole had to a grandmother, and the closest thing Ryan had to a reason to trust the concept of grace, lived 4 blocks away and sat with Cole on the evenings Ryan worked. He'd met her at Tommy's physical therapy center 18 months after coming home. She'd been in the waiting area, while Tommy ran through his upper body session, reading a paperback with the careful attention of someone who reads as a discipline rather than a pleasure. She'd looked up when Ryan walked in, and her face had done something he hadn't expected, not accusation, not the blankness of someone suppressing it, something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, of who he was and what he carried. She'd said, "Thomas talks about you." He hadn't known what to do with that. She'd said, "Sit down, you're not in trouble. He wants you to visit." It had taken Ryan 3 more months to actually go. But he'd gone, and Tommy Thomas, 29 now, Medford kid who'd wanted to fly since age 7, who was relearning what his body could do from a wheelchair with a ferocity that made Ryan's throat close every time he witnessed. It had looked at him from across the rec room at the VA center and said, flat and clear, "Stop making this about you and come play cards." He'd played cards. He came back. Margaret had become the person Cole called Miss Maggie. She made a casserole once a week that appeared in Ryan's refrigerator through some logistical arrangement he'd stopped questioning. She had never once asked Ryan to feel better, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever not done for him. Tuesday night. 9:22. Ryan signed in, collected his cart, took the elevator to 14. The executive floor at night had a quality that he'd grown to understand over these past 23 months. During the day, it performed all sharp surfaces and deliberate presentation, the architecture of institutional authority. At night, it became something quieter, more honest, the lights dialed down to their cleaning hour setting, the carpet visible in its actual color, rather than under overhead fluorescence, the skyline through the windows real, in a way it never quite seemed when people were moving in front of it. He worked the hallway first. Glass office doors, the conference room, the small kitchen with its precise appliances. Then the main corner office, Sandra Weston's office. He'd noticed the light was still on when he stepped off the elevator. He'd noticed when it went off that subtle shift from gold to dark under the door gap. He didn't knock. That wasn't the arrangement. He waited by the cart at the far end of the hall until the sound of her gathering her things carried faintly through the closed door, then started on the conference room and worked toward her office after she'd gone. There was a coffee cup on her desk she'd left without rinsing. A notepad with something written in her fast, angular hand. He didn't read it. It was angled away, and the configuration of a desk that had been worked at late by someone running 2 tracks simultaneously. The task in front of them, and something else entirely, somewhere else. He knew that configuration. He'd lived in it for years. He cleaned the desk surface around the notepad, emptied the small bin, straightened the framed photograph on the credenza her father George Weston. Younger, standing in front of a prop plane, in what looked like the early 90s, the grin of a man who has just done something he's proud of and wants to make sure someone records it. Ryan had seen George Weston twice in 23 months. Once in the lobby, once on the 14th floor. Large man, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the bearing of someone who understood that rooms responded to them. He'd looked at Ryan the second time, the way people looked at maintenance staff, when they remembered to look at all passing acknowledgement. Already, moving on, Ryan had found this neither offensive nor worth thinking about. He moved to the window and cleaned the glass from the top corner down, the city reassembling itself in the clean surface as the smear of fingerprints and Portland weather came off, each pass of the squeegee overlapping the last by 2 inches. No gap, no streak. He thought about the helicopter. He'd spent the bus ride home this afternoon not thinking about it, which was the same as thinking about it continuously. The weight of the collective in his hand, the sound of the engine under his feet, not the simulator's approximation, not the digital recreation, the actual turbine, the actual air. The way Portland had looked from 2,000 feet, familiar and strange, his city seen from the angle he'd once seen everything from. He hadn't flown in 3 years and 4 months. He'd known the certificate was current. He'd renewed it in February, sitting at the kitchen table while Cole drew at the other end, filling out the paperwork with the strange dual sensation of maintaining something he had no intention of using. A reflex. The way people kept piano skills alive even when they'd stopped performing. Some part of them unwilling to fully close a door. Or maybe cowardice wearing the mask of practicality. He wasn't sure which. He'd stopped trying to distinguish between them a long time ago. What he knew was this. The moment he'd seen the helicopter sitting there on that rooftop, full tank, blades stilled, the morning air around it, waiting, something had moved in him. Not the dramatic internal reckoning of memory meeting meaning. Just a fact asserting itself. I can do this. She needs this. These are 2 true things existing at the same time. He'd spoken before the other part of him could redirect. I can fly it. 3 words. He'd meant them the way he meant most things without theater, without the expectation that meaning them would feel like anything in particular. He finished the window, moved to the next section of glass. He did not think about what Sandra Weston had said in response. He did not think about it in the elevator on the way down, or on the bus home, or while he heated Cole's dinner and watched his son eat with the focused pleasure of a 5-year-old who had recently discovered that dinosaur-shaped pasta was, philosophically speaking, better than regular pasta. He did not think about it when Cole asked, through a mouthful of stegosaurus, whether airplanes could fly upside down, which opened a 20-minute conversation that Ryan participated in with genuine interest, because Cole's curiosity about flight had been running since the boy could talk, and Ryan had long since stopped, pretending this was coincidental. Cole's notebook sat on the table beside his plate as it always did. It went everywhere with him, a spiral-bound thing that had been replaced twice already as Cole filled pages. Aircraft of every type, some real, some entirely invented, some real aircraft modified with additions Cole found aesthetically necessary. 4 wings, extra engines, the occasional rocket attached to the tail. Ryan looked at the notebook, while Cole explained a modification to a 747 that would, Cole believed, allow it to travel significantly faster than currently possible. He thought about Laura, the way he thought about her most evenings at this hour, not the accident, not Highway 26, not the voicemail he'd listened to too many times, in the months after coming home, and had now listened to exactly twice in the past year. He thought about the way she'd talked about flight. She wasn't afraid of it, but it was foreign to her, a world that made sense to him in ways she'd taken on faith. She'd used to say, I don't need to understand it, I just need to trust the pilot, and she'd smile when she said it, meaning him, meaning also something larger than him. He'd failed the larger thing. That was the part he couldn't fix with logic. He could construct a complete argument for why what happened was not his fault. The argument was essentially sound. His CO had made it, the Army's review board had made it, implicitly. He'd been overseas because that was his assignment. She'd died because a driver on Highway 26 had a mechanical failure at the wrong moment. The distance between him and Portland on October 14th, 2021 was the Army's business and the weather's business, and the pure arithmetic of bad timing. He knew all of this. Knowing it had not, in practice, changed the texture of 4 o'clock in the morning. Cole finished his dinosaur pasta. Ryan washed the dishes. They read for 45 minutes. Cole's current obsession was a series about a young boy who secretly maintained a fleet of miniature aircraft in a converted barn, which Ryan had started to understand was less a book series and more a lifestyle aspiration. Cole fell asleep mid-chapter, his small hand still loosely holding the book, the kink of his blonde hair against the pillow, exactly the way Laura's had kinked when she slept. Ryan put the book on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, stood in the doorway for a moment. Cole made the small sounds of deep sleep, the slight rhythm of it, the complete safety of a child who has gone under without reservation, who trusts that the world is where he left it. Ryan closed the door, got his jacket, left a note in the kitchen for Margaret, who had a key and would come by at 9 to check. Walked to the bus stop on Hawthorne in the October dark. The bus came at 8:52. He rode it north through the city, watching Portland move past the rain-blurred windows, and practiced thinking about almost nothing. This was a trained skill, not a natural gift, the deliberate quiet that came from years of briefing rooms and waiting, and the enforced patience of operations, where the ability to rest your mind between periods of intensity was functional, not passive. He got off at the Western Aviation stop, signed in at 9:22, went to work. He was on the 8th floor, in the West Corridor, at 11:40, when the elevator opened and Sandra Weston stepped out. She was still in the clothes she'd worn that morning, the dark jacket, the fitted trousers, the heels that made a sound on the corridor flooring, that everyone on his shift had learned to identify at 30 feet. But something was different about the way she was moving. Not less certain, less directed. She was walking the way people walked when they'd ended up somewhere by not making the active choice to be anywhere else. She saw him immediately. Stopped. Ryan kept his hands on the cart, waited. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not accusation, not the look people gave him when they'd figured out something they weren't sure how to use. Something more unformed than that. Something that was still assembling itself. "You didn't wait," she said. Not accusational. The flight was over. He kept his voice neutral. There was nothing to wait for. She came a few steps closer. Her hands were at her sides. "I never got your name, Ryan." A pause. "Mercer." She nodded, like this confirmed something. Which he supposed it did. "I know who you are," she said. "I mean, I looked. After. The FAA record. The ceremony." Another pause, smaller. The obituary. Something moved through him. Not anger. Not the hot defensive tightening that news of being researched might have produced in another context. Closer to resignation, the clean, unsentimental version, the kind that came not from giving up, but from having long since recalibrated what you expected from the world. "Then you know I'm not that person anymore," he said. She didn't agree with this, didn't dispute it either. She just looked at him with that unresolved expression, and what she finally said was, "You're still someone, not a comfort, not a challenge, something sitting between those two things." The kind of statement that didn't require a response because it wasn't looking for one. The corridor was quiet. The building's HVAC ran its steady background note. Somewhere below them, the city continued being the city. Ryan looked at her, looked away. "The deal went through?" he asked. "Signed at 11:47. Good, yes, a beat." "It is." Neither of them said anything else. She looked at the cart, then at the hallway stretching ahead of him, then back at him. Something in her face resolved into a decision of some kind, though what decision, and about what, he couldn't tell. She walked back to the elevator. The doors closed. Ryan stood in the corridor for a moment with his hands not on the cart. Then he took a breath, picked up his supplies, and went back to work. There is a difference between noticing someone and actually seeing them. Sandra had been watched her entire professional life. By the board. By her father's longtime colleagues who had opinions about her age, and her gender, and her right to the chair she was sitting in. By the industry contacts who smiled across tables while calculating whether she was someone worth knowing or someone to wait out. Being watched was ambient. She had stopped registering. You stopped registering it the way you stopped registering the hum of a building's ventilation. What happened in the weeks after the rooftop was different. She started noticing Ryan Mercer the way you noticed a crack in a wall you'd walked past 100 times. Not because it appeared suddenly. Because something shifted in your attention, and suddenly the thing that was always there became impossible to look past. Tuesday, he ate in the stairwell on the 8th floor. Not the break room, not the cafeteria on 3, the stairwell. A sandwich from a brown bag, an apple, 15 minutes exactly, alone. No phone, no book. Just sitting on the concrete step with his back against the wall. Eating with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that this was refueling, not recreation. She saw this by accident coming down from a late meeting, stopping 2 steps above the landing. He didn't see her. She didn't announce herself. She went back up and took the elevator instead. Thursday, Cole was asleep on the bench in the 11th floor hallway. At 11:15, small figure curled on his side, the notebook tucked under one arm, Ryan's jacket draped over him with the precision of someone who had performed this act of care many times and knew exactly how to position a jacket so it wouldn't slip. Ryan was 20 feet away, cleaning the glass partition of the conference room, checking back on his son and every third pass, with the peripheral awareness of a man who had trained himself to monitor multiple things simultaneously. Friday, she came in at 7 in the morning and found in the simulator room that the malfunctioning pressure sensor on the training rig, the one the avionics team had flagged for service 3 weeks ago and hadn't gotten to, was working. No service ticket, no paperwork, just working. She checked the maintenance log. Nothing, asked Timothy. He didn't know. She pulled the security footage from the night before and watched Ryan Mercer open the access panel, examine the sensor board with the systematic attention of someone who understood what they were looking at, reseat 2 connections, run a check cycle, and close the panel. 11 minutes total. Then, he picked up his supplies and moved on, without noting it anywhere. She watched that footage twice. Then she sat with the discomfort of a person who has been wrong about something for 23 months and is only now calculating the full scope of the error. She had never asked his name. In all those months of walking past him in hallways, of occupying the same building during the same hours, of once watching his son get reprimanded by Donna for touching a model in the lobby and choosing to keep walking because she had somewhere to be, she had never once asked the name of the man who held an airline transport pilot certificate, a Medal of Valor, and the ability to diagnose avionics faults that stumped her own maintenance team and showed up every evening at 9:22 to mop floors, not because he was invisible, because she had chosen not to look. And those, she was learning, were not the same thing. The consulting offer came to her on a Saturday morning, which was unusual because Sandra spent Saturday mornings running 6 miles, the East Bank Esplanade. The bridges counting off like mile markers. She processed things on runs that she couldn't process sitting still. The rhythm did something to her cognition, loosened what was held too tight. She was on the Hawthorne Bridge when it arrived fully formed. Robert Callahan had called on Wednesday, 2 days after the signing. He'd been direct. The simulator training program Callahan Industries was building for their new fleet required a technical consultant who understood rotary wing operations at the level of someone who'd actually done it in conditions where getting it wrong had consequences. Not the textbook version. The version where the aircraft is behaving strangely and you make a decision in the dark. He wanted Ryan Mercer. She said she'd look into it. Running on Saturday morning, Watching the Willamette move below the bridge grating, she decided she'd offer it. Not because Callahan had asked. Because she had spent 23 months running a company her father built, while simultaneously failing to see a man who was, by any honest professional measure, operating at a fraction of his actual capacity. At some point, the ledger of what you'd overlooked required balancing. She set up the meeting for Monday. Ryan arrived at her office at 3:10. Still in the gray uniform, he sat across from her with the straight posture he always had organized. Not rigid, the posture of someone whose back had been shaped by years of physical discipline and held the habit after everything else changed. She put the offer on the table. The terms were good. The hours were flexible. The work was primarily remote, with occasional on-site visits to Callahan's facility south of Portland. He read the summary sheet with care. "Why?" he asked. "Simple, not suspicious. Direct, because you're wasted mopping floors." She kept her voice factual. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the paper. Then, "Whose idea was this, Callahan's?" I agreed. Because I looked at your certificate and your service record, and the simulator sensor you fixed without being asked. And I have an obligation to allocate talent correctly." A beat. That's a very business school way to describe a situation. "I run a company." He put the paper down. "I appreciate it, the warmth of a person who means what they say and doesn't add anything decorative." No, Sandra had anticipated reluctance, had not anticipated how complete and immediate the refusal would be. "Can I ask why? I don't need a title." He looked at her directly. "I don't need to be remembered. I need Cole to be safe and to feel safe. That's what I'm building right now. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I know they aren't theoretically." His voice remained even, unhurried. "But I've learned the distance between what's theoretically true and what's true for a specific person in a specific situation. For me, right now, visibility is risk, not financial risk. The other kind." Sandra held his gaze. "What kind?" "The kind where Cole gets attached to a version of me that I'm not sure I can sustain." A brief pause. "He's 5. He thinks I can do anything. I'd like to keep that intact as long as possible." The room went quiet. This was not the answer she'd prepared for. She had prepared for practical objections: money, scheduling, the logistics of a complicated life. She had not prepared for an answer that was entirely about his son and not about himself at all. "You can be both," she said. The words came out before she'd weighed them. A father and a pilot. Those aren't opposing categories. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his face, not agreement, not dismissal. The expression of a person who has just heard something true that they don't yet know what to do with. He stood. "Thank you for the offer." He walked out. Sandra sat with the paper on her desk and the quiet of a room where something important had just been declined, and thought about the fact that the most useful thing she'd said in the conversation had come out entirely unplanned. Outside the window, Portland was doing what Portland did in late October, going gray and green and damp, the hills holding their color against a sky that was deciding whether to rain. She looked at it for a while. Then she looked at the closed door and thought about the distance between what's theoretically true and what's true for a specific person, a specific situation, and whether that principle applied to anyone other than Ryan Mercer. She suspected it did. She suspected she'd been avoiding that suspicion for 2 years. George Weston did not telephone first. This was characteristic. Her father operated on the principle that announcements were for people who needed permission, and he had not required permission to enter any room he'd ever been in. He walked into Sandra's office on a Thursday morning, holding a manila folder the way he held everything, as though the object were an extension of his will rather than something he was carrying. 71 years old. 2 years past his cardiac warning. Still broad across the shoulders, still with the walk of a man who had built something real and wanted rooms to know it, not through boasting, but through the weight of his presence. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited. Sandra put her pen down. "We need to discuss something," George said, setting the folder on the desk between them. She looked at the folder. Did not open it. About what? About the choices you're making. He kept his voice measured. Her father, in measured mode, was her father at his most controlled, which meant this was a topic he'd been thinking about for a while and had decided to approach carefully. People are talking. People talk about everything. About Ryan Mercer. He opened the folder himself. Inside, the FAA certificate printout, the Oregonian ceremony piece, 2 memos from members of the building's management staff that had apparently gone to George rather than to Sandra. She noted the specific nature of this, that her father had sources in her company who reported to him directly and filed it for later. You're spending time with him. He flew me to the most important meeting of this company's last 4 years, and I said thank you to him once in the lobby. That's the full scope of the situation. That's not what I'm hearing. Then what you're hearing is incomplete. Sandra kept her voice even. Not because she wasn't angry, she was. But anger worked better when it was cold. He's an employee. He did something exceptional. I acknowledged it. George's jaw moved, something earlier than a frown. He's a janitor with a child and a history, and he's a decorated combat veteran with an ATP certificate who fixed one of our simulator sensors in 11 minutes that our avionics team had been sitting on for 3 weeks. She held her father's gaze. That's who he is. That's what he was. Is. Silence. George looked at her. She looked at him. This was a thing they had done since she was a child, the standing contest, the stillness competition, the mutual assessment of how far the other one was going to go. He'd won most of them when she was young. The ratio had changed considerably. Sandra. His voice dropped. Less measured now. Something more genuine underneath, which was actually harder to counter than the controlled version. I built this company. I built everything in this building. I'm not asking you to think badly of the man. I'm asking you to think clearly. I am thinking clearly. He walked away from everything he was. He's choosing to disappear. That's not. He's protecting his son. Her voice came out sharp, one clean edge. He's doing what a father does when he has nothing else solid left. Solid. He's building a wall around the one thing that still matters and standing in front of it. She stopped, drew a breath. You would have done the same thing. George Weston went quiet. This landed. She could see it land not in his expression, which remained composed, but in the slight change in how he was occupying the chair, some degree of the forward press of his conviction settling back an inch. She wasn't done. You gave me this company, steady. Clear. No heat in it. You said it was mine to run. If that's true, then it's mine. And the decisions I make about the people in it are mine. She looked at him directly. If that's not true, if this is still your company and you're running it from Lake Oswego through management staff who send you memos behind my back, then tell me. And I'll go. The room held that. George looked at her for a long moment. His hands were flat on the armrests of the chair. The folder sat between them on the desk, the printed pages that someone had assembled for him, evidence of a situation he'd been monitoring from a distance while pretending to have stepped back. He picked up the folder, stood. At the door he paused. Didn't turn around immediately. The posture of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether saying it costs him more than not saying it. A man who builds a wall around his child, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the rhetorical framework, knows what's worth protecting. A beat. That's not nothing. Then he left. Sandra sat very still after the door closed. Her hands were pressed flat on the desk surface, the posture of someone who has just held something together through applied will and is now doing a quiet structural inventory. She looked at the door, then at the window, then at the Callahan contract on the credenza framed and signed, because Timothy had thought it should be framed and she hadn't disagreed. Her father had not apologized, had not conceded the argument, had said the least possible thing that acknowledged the most, and then removed himself. This was, she recognized, the closest George Weston got to backing down. She told him she would go. She'd meant it. Which surprised her, even now, alone in the room where she'd said it surprised her, because she'd built so much of herself around not being someone who walked away from things. But apparently, she had decided somewhere between the Hawthorne Bridge on Saturday morning and this conversation that there were positions she would not soften to keep a peace she hadn't agreed to keep. People she would not abandon to keep a room comfortable. She didn't examine that too closely. Not yet. What she did notice, sitting alone on the 14th floor after her father's car had pulled out of the parking structure below, was that she hadn't thought once about the $11 million while she was talking. She'd thought about Ryan Mercer and a 5-year-old boy and a wall built out of quiet choices and gray uniforms and renewed certificates. She turned back to her desk, picked up her pen. And what she didn't know sitting there in the afternoon light of her 14th floor office was that George Weston, pulling onto the Burnside Bridge in his car, had picked up his phone and called Robert Callahan, not to interfere, just to ask a single question: where was the aviation summit being held? And would it be appropriate for him to attend as a silent observer? Callahan had said yes. George had said thank you, and hung up and driven home to Lake Oswego, where he sat in his study for a long time looking at the photograph of himself and a prop plane from the early 90s, thinking about what it meant to build something and then have to learn to trust it to someone else. 3 weeks after the conversation with her father, Sandra found Cole in the hallway outside the simulator room. She'd stayed late. The MRO contract revision was in its 4th draft, and she'd made the mistake of reading the whole thing, instead of delegating the final pass to legal, which meant she was still on the 14th floor at 11:20 when she should have been home an hour ago. She gathered her things, took the elevator at 8 to pick up a printout she'd forgotten from the secondary printer. The elevator opened. The hallway was dim in its after-hours configuration, the cleaning lights low and institutional. She heard it before she saw anything. Soft, muffled. The sound of a child trying not to be heard. She turned the corner and stopped. Cole was on the floor outside the simulator room, knees pulled to his chest, face wet, doing the effortful breathing of a 5-year-old who has been crying for a while and is now doing his best to stop. The yellow notebook was pressed between his knees and his chest, held there like something that needed protecting. Cole looked up. He blinked at her, tracking her face with the openness of a child who hasn't yet installed the filters adults use to manage who sees what. Not alarmed, not performing, just looking. "Daddy's inside," he said, quiet, hiccuping slightly on the words. He said he needed a minute. She looked through the glass panel in the simulator room door. Ryan was in the nearest flight rig. Not set up for a simulation. The screens were dark, the panels unpowered. He was simply sitting in the seat, both hands on the cyclic and collective in their proper positions, like he'd climbed in and then found he couldn't start. His head was down. His shoulders were doing the small, contained movement of someone who is crying carefully, the way adults cried when they'd had years of practice limiting the visible radius of their grief. Sandra looked at this for only a moment. Then she sat down on the floor next to Cole. Cole looked at her, evaluating, the way his father evaluated, not suspicious, just thorough. Deciding something. He had a bad dream about Mommy, Cole said, at home, but then he couldn't sleep. So we came here. Sandra didn't ask how often this happened. She had a sense, from the matter-of-fact quality of Cole's explanation, that it was a known variable in their life together. Something Cole had learned to navigate with the pragmatic adaptability of a child raised in circumstances that required it. "Does it help?" she asked, keeping her voice light. The tone of someone asking about something ordinary. Cole considered this seriously. Sometimes. He usually feels better after a while. A pause. He used to not feel better at all. Now sometimes he does. Sandra absorbed this. The hope in that word, sometimes not ignorant hope, calibrated hope. The hope of a 5-year-old who had been paying close attention for a long time and was reporting what he'd actually observed. She didn't ask Cole what his mother had been like. She didn't ask him to perform his grief for her to see. She just sat on the industrial carpet next to him in the dim corridor, and when Cole slowly, with the deliberateness of a child, making a real decision, leaned his shoulder against her arm, she didn't move away. They sat like that for a while. The building running its nighttime systems around them, Portland doing what it did outside the walls. The simulator room door opened at 11:51. Ryan stepped out. Eyes that had been red and were now controlled. Face reassembled into the composed version, the one he maintained for the world, the expression of a person who has done what they needed to do in private and is returning to the version of themselves they present elsewhere. He saw Sandra stopped. The reassembled expression shifted, not into vulnerability exactly, but into something less armored. The way a structure looks different when the scaffolding comes down and you see the actual surface underneath. I didn't know anyone was here. The words came out fast. Professional reflex. Sandra stood, guiding Cole gently upright. Ryan crossed to them, and Cole went to his father without drama or theatrical relief, just moved into his father's space, with the easy certainty of someone returning to where they belonged. Ryan held him. He looked at Sandra over Cole's shoulder, and she saw for the first time in all the corridor interactions, and the one rooftop conversation, and the months of occupying the same building, she saw the thing he kept behind everything else. Not weakness, the wrong word entirely. Something more like the load. The actual weight of what he was carrying, visible for a moment, without the insulation of composure to make it manageable for other people. You don't have to explain anything, Sandra said. He exhaled. Something in his chest lowered slightly. I was doing all right with it, quiet, and then I wasn't. And I didn't want Cole to see it at home, so he stopped. I know that. It makes sense, Sandra said, a beat. Then, lower, with the quality of someone setting something down that they'd been carrying a long distance. I had to make a call. Overseas, my crew, my co-pilot, the mission. He wasn't looking at her. Looking at a point somewhere past her shoulder, at nothing specific. I made the right call. By every standard that exists for evaluating that kind of decision. Tommy Briggs came home alive. The pause was deliberate, long enough to mean something. And he came home in a wheelchair, and I came home with a medal, and I have never once been certain those belong in the same sentence. Sandra didn't try to resolve this. Didn't offer the standard comfort that would have been accurate and useless simultaneously. She understood not from combat, not from anything she'd experienced that mapped onto it, but in the structural way that certain truths about human decision-making were true regardless of context. That some choices are correct and still break something. That the world has no mechanism for reconciling those two facts. That the medal and the wheelchair were both real, and both the result of the same moment, and neither of them cancelled out the other. I had someone, she said. Not because she'd planned to. Because it was the honest response and she'd run out of reasons to keep it back. Before. When I was made CEO, we were engaged. He left that week. Said he couldn't build a life with someone who was running her father's company, like I'd chosen it over him. Like refusing my father's cardiac event was something I'd declined to do. She stopped. I decided after that not needing anyone was a form of strength, that it protected me from that specific kind of damage. Ryan looked at her. I've been wrong about that, she said. For 2 years, and I've been very efficiently wrong about it, which is, I think, its own particular problem. The corridor was quiet between them. Cole had gone drowsy against Ryan's shoulder, the dead weight of a child descending towards sleep. Ryan's voice was careful, placed. You said I could be both, father and pilot. He looked at her steadily. Have you tried it? Being both things at once. CEO, and someone who doesn't have to manage everything alone. Sandra didn't answer immediately, because the answer required honesty she hadn't fully deployed yet. And honesty required accepting that the question was accurate, and accepting that required something from her that she'd gotten very good at redirecting. Not yet, she said. Ryan nodded. Small, once not satisfied, not pushing. The nod of a person who was asked a real question and received a real answer and seasoned, considers that sufficient for now. Sandra went home at midnight. Drove back through the city with the heater running and the radio off, Portland moving past the windows in its nighttime configuration, wet streets, signal lights, the orange silver of sodium lamps on rain-slick asphalt. She thought about the simulator room. About Ryan sitting in the powered-down rig with his hands in position and nowhere to go. She thought about what it meant to maintain a certificate you weren't using. The February renewal. The paperwork filled out at a kitchen table while a child drew at the other end. The keeping open of a door you weren't walking through. Not hope exactly. Not surrender either. Something that sat between those two things, which might be the most honest place a person could stand after enough loss. She drove home and didn't call anyone, and didn't open her laptop. She sat in her apartment in the South Park blocks, and listened to the city outside her window for a while, and thought about what it cost to be efficient at being alone, and whether efficiency was the right standard to apply to a life. The email from Robert Callahan arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the corridor conversation. It was addressed to Ryan Mercer directly, not through Sandra, not through Western Aviation's HR system. Callahan had sourced Ryan's contact through the military records database and the Oregonian archive, which was more digging than Sandra had expected, and suggested a level of personal investment in the outcome. The email was concise. A precision flight demonstration at the annual Callahan Aviation Summit, a private event held at the company's facility south of Portland for investors and industry partners. No press access, no public component, just Ryan. A Bell 407, and an audience of people who understood enough about aviation to recognize what mastery looked like. In exchange, a full 4-year scholarship for Cole at any one of 3 named private schools in Portland. Ryan forwarded it to Sandra that afternoon. No message. Just the forward, sitting in her inbox like a question he didn't know how to ask out loud. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "You didn't know about this." "I didn't." She kept her voice steady. "He asked about you in the first call after the signing. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't think he'd go directly to you. But you gave him my information." A pause. "I gave him your service record citation. It's public record. He found your contact himself." Silence on the line. "Then, why did you give him anything?" "Because I thought you should have the option." She chose her words carefully. Not defensive. Explaining. "I wasn't making the decision for you. I was making sure the decision existed to be made." Another silence. "Longer. It's a scholarship," he said. "Flat, not cold. Processing. For Cole." "Yes, good schools. I looked them up." "All 3. "Yes." He was quiet again. She could hear him breathing. The faint sound of outdoor air behind him, wind, distant traffic. The building's rear loading dock, probably, where maintenance staff took their breaks. She'd seen him there. "I don't want this to be about me," he said finally. "Then, make it about Cole. That's the only reason I'm still on the phone." She said nothing. "Let that land where it needed to, if I do this," he said. Each word placed with care. "I need someone on the ground. Not Callahan's people. Someone he stopped. Started again. "A voice I recognize. If I need to abort, I need to know the channel is clean and the person on the other end is someone I trust." "Ground support," Sandra said. Just that. Headset and channel. Nothing more complicated. She understood. Not just the technical requirement, which she also understood. She was hearing a man who was going to attempt something he hadn't attempted in 3 years and needed one thing to be solid while he did it. One fixed point. One voice that wasn't a stranger's. "I'll be there," she said, on the ground. The whole time, he didn't say thank you. He said, "Okay, I'll do it." 2 words carrying the weight of everything he'd set down 3 years ago and was now carefully picking back up. Sandra held the phone after the call ended. Sat at her desk, with it in her hand, the screen dark, the afternoon light coming through the windows at the low November angle that made the city look like it was lit from inside rather than above. She thought about what she'd just agreed to. Not the ground support role, the logistics of that were straightforward. She'd done flight line coordination before. She knew the protocols, and the abort signals, and the emergency contacts. She thought about what it meant to stand on the ground and hold the channel for someone who was going up. She had spent 2 years being the person in motion. The one deciding and moving and going, not standing still, not waiting. She was going to put on a headset, stand on a landing pad south of Portland, and be the voice someone else flew back toward. She looked at the Callahan contract on the credenza framed, signed, evidence. Then she looked at the window. Portland in November. The river somewhere past the rooftops. The hills somewhere past that. And the sky above all of it clear for once. One of those days that arrived a handful of times a year and felt like something the city hadn't quite earned. She thought, some people fly toward things. Some people learn, later than they should, that the ground has its own kind of courage. She didn't know yet which kind she was becoming, but she thought she might be about to find out. 5 days before the demonstration, Sandra opened the simulator room at 9 o'clock each evening. She told Timothy it was extended maintenance access. She told building security the same. Neither of them had enough context to question it. She cleared the access, ensured the room was ready, and arrived each night with a cup of coffee and her laptop, and the intention to be present without being in the way. Ryan arrived at 9:15 the first night. He stood outside the door for a moment. She could see him through the glass. The pause that wasn't hesitation exactly, but the pause of a person consciously choosing to cross a threshold rather than drifting across it. Choosing to be somewhere rather than just ending up there. He came in. He sat in the rig. Sandra stayed at the technician's station on the far side of the room. Opened her laptop. Looked at it without reading anything on the screen. For 12 minutes, Ryan sat in the unpowered rig. Hands in position on the controls. Eyes forward, the screens dark around him. Not doing anything that had an external measurement. Doing something that existed entirely on the interior. Then he powered the rig on. The screens came up. Portland airspace rendered in training-grade detail. The familiar geography of the city translated into instrument data. He ran through the startup sequence from memory, each step in its proper order, no reference to any checklist. He flew for 14 minutes. When he powered down, he sat for another 3 minutes in the post-flight quiet. Then he climbed out, put on his jacket, and left without saying anything. Sandra closed her laptop. She sat in the empty simulator room for a few minutes after he left. The screens in standby mode, the equipment settling, the room returning to its institutional quiet. She thought about what it took, not the technical part, which she understood, but the other part. The going back in. The choosing to occupy the exact space where something broke, and staying there until the space became yours again, rather than the breaks. She had been told by someone she respected a long time ago, that courage was not the absence of the thing that frightened you. It was the decision to proceed in its presence. She had applied that principle almost exclusively to professional situations, board meetings, difficult contracts, conversations with her father that required holding a position under sustained pressure. She had not applied it to anything that cost her something real. The second night, Ryan flew for 20 minutes. The third night, he asked her to run a weather scenario. Crosswind from the west, reduced visibility, turbulence in the lower altitudes. She set it up from the technician's station and watched him fly through it. His hands moved with the assurance of someone for whom these conditions were not extraordinary. Difficult, yes. Outside the ordinary, yes. But within his range, comfortably. He flew through the scenario without a single unnecessary correction. She reset it, and he flew through it again. The fourth night, he didn't go into the rig. He came in, stood in front of it for a moment, and then sat down on the floor in front of the door. Back against the wall, knees up, not the posture of someone who has given up. The posture of someone who has hit a wall they weren't expecting and is being honest about it, instead of pretending it isn't there. Sandra closed her laptop, crossed the room, sat down next to him on the floor. They sat in the low light and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. The building ran its nighttime systems around them. Outside, Portland was being Portland, wet and green and indifferent and constant. Then Ryan. Tomorrow Cole will ask if I'm scared. Sandra waited. I'll tell him yes. He looked at the rig in front of them, the dark screens, the instrumentation, the seat he'd climbed in and out of over 4 evenings. And I'll tell him I'm flying anyway. Sandra turned that over, sad. That's how you raise a son. He looked at her. Something in his face, not quite relief, not quite recognition. Something that lived in the space between those two things without needing a label. They sat for a while longer. Neither of them moved to fill the silence. Because some silences were not absences. They were the substance of something that hadn't found words yet, and filling them too soon would lose what they were holding. At 11:15, Ryan stood, picked up his jacket, at the door, without turning around. Sandra. She looked up. Thank you. Quiet. The weight of a word used by someone who doesn't spend it unless it's accurate. She said, See you on the ground. She turned the lights off, stood in the dark simulator room for a moment before following. Tomorrow was the day. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not the one preparing to take off. She was the one who was going to hold the line while someone else remembered how to fly. She thought that might be the harder job. The morning of the demonstration arrived the way significant mornings often did, quickly, without ceremony. The alarm at 5:15, the dark outside the window still complete, Portland not yet doing anything that could be called waking. Sandra had slept 4 hours. Not because she was anxious, she'd examined that possibility and found it wasn't quite right. More like the feeling before a long flight, when the body understood something consequential was coming and decided sleep was a secondary priority. She made coffee. Stood at the kitchen window of her apartment in the South Park blocks and watched the city begin its negotiations with the day. The streetlights on the park still running. A single cyclist moving through the intersection below with the unhurried confidence of someone who had the roads to themselves and knew it. She thought about ground support. The technical elements were straightforward. She'd pulled the protocols the night before. Standard air-to-ground communication setup, the headset Callahan's team was providing, the frequency Ryan would be on. She knew the abort signals. She knew the emergency contacts. The procedural architecture of it was not the part that required preparation. What required preparation was the other thing, standing still while someone else moved. Holding the line and not the controls. Being the fixed point that someone flew back toward, instead of the person already in motion. She had been doing something like that for 4 evenings, in the simulator room, sitting at the technician's station, while Ryan worked through whatever he was working through. And she had found, to her own surprise, that she was capable of it, that the stillness didn't feel like inaction, that there was a kind of presence in it that she hadn't previously counted as anything. She drank the coffee, got dressed. Dark jacket, practical shoes, flight line, not boardroom, hair pulled back but not the tight armored bun of her working day. Something slightly less fortified, which she noticed and chose to leave. She picked up the small paper bag from the kitchen counter. Inside, a pair of aviator sunglasses with yellow lenses, the kind that gave everything a warmer quality in low contrast light. Small, size for a 5-year-old. She'd found them at a store on Burnside 2 days ago and bought them without deliberating. Had written on a small card in her direct, angular handwriting, for the best co-pilot on the ground. Had left the bag on the kitchen counter for 2 days. Not second-guessing. Just letting it be a decision that had already been made. She put it in her bag, went to the parking garage. Drove south on I-5 toward the Callahan facility. The day was November clear. One of those high-pressure mornings that arrived a handful of times a year and felt like something borrowed from a better season. The sky was the color of good intentions. The hills to the east caught the early light with the cooperation of geography that had no obligation to be beautiful and was anyway. She got to the facility at 7:40. The Callahan Aviation Summit used their private airfield's 60 acres of tarmac and hangar space south of the city, the kind of facility that existed because there were people who could afford the kind of aviation that didn't involve commercial terminals or TSA lines or seats that didn't fit. The main hangar had been opened up and configured for the event. Viewing stands on the south side of the field. A staging area near the flight line. 230 people expected. Investors, engineers, executives from 3 regional aviation companies, a contingent from the FAA's regional training division attending in a professional capacity. Not a press event, but not small. Sandra walked the flight line at 7:55, checked the headset setup, verified the frequency, spoke briefly with Callahan's ground operations coordinator, a woman named Teresa, who had the practiced calm of someone who had run flight operations for 20 years and considered drama an amateur quality. They understood each other immediately. Ryan arrived at 8:10. He came in Margaret Briggs's pickup truck, the faded blue Ford that Sandra recognized from the Western Aviation parking lot. Cole was in the passenger seat. They both got out, and Sandra watched from across the tarmac as Cole stood in the morning light looking at the airfield with his whole face open in the way that 5-year-olds had not yet learned to moderate. He looked like someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been going for their entire life. Ryan was in the flight suit Sandra had arranged, borrowed from Western Aviation's flight operations department. A suit in his size hanging in the staging area locker when he arrived to check in. No announcement, no fanfare. It fit correctly. He moved in it the way he moved in everything, as though clothing was functional rather than meaningful. As though the important things were not visible. He looked across the tarmac and found her. They held each other's gaze for a moment across the staging area. Then Sandra picked up the paper bag from the equipment table and crossed the tarmac toward them. Cole saw her first. His face ran through its calculation, recognition, assessment, conclusion in about half a second, and the conclusion was positive. He had his notebook under his arm, a small tear at the left elbow of his jacket that Ryan apparently hadn't gotten around to replacing yet. "You came," Cole said, satisfied, as though this confirmed a theory he'd been developing. "I'm on the ground today," Sandra said. "Someone has to hold the channel." Cole looked at her with the gravity of a person who understood this was important without knowing all the reasons why. Then she held out the paper bag. He took it, opened it, extracted the aviator sunglasses with the yellow lenses. He put them on immediately. They were almost exactly the right size. He tilted, his chin up, and looked at the airfield through the yellow lenses, with an expression that suggested he had just been given a significant upgrade in his capacity to assess aviation operations. Ryan was watching his son, not smiling, something quieter than smiling. The expression of a man watching something small and irreplaceable do something entirely ordinary, put on a pair of sunglasses, and finding it almost more than he could hold in the way. That parents found things when they'd been paying close enough attention for long enough. Sandra didn't look at Ryan. She looked at Cole, for the best co-pilot on the ground. "Your job today is to watch, all of it. Don't miss anything." Cole nodded with total seriousness, adjusted the glasses. "I won't." She looked at Ryan then. He was looking at her, and the thing she'd been seeing more of lately, the door that opened a fraction, was open further than she'd seen it. Not all the way, but further than before. "Frequency check in 30, she said. "Practical. Clear, copy that," his voice in ground mode. "Professional." And underneath it something that wasn't professional, that was personal and warm, and possibly the thing she'd been circling for weeks without being willing to name it directly. She went back to the flight line. The event started at 9 o'clock with Robert Callahan speaking to the assembled crowd in the hangar. Sandra caught pieces of it from the flight line through the PA system. He talked about precision, about the gap between theoretical capacity and demonstrated performance, about what it looked like when someone operated at the actual ceiling of their ability. He did not mention Ryan by name. He introduced the demonstration as a showcase of what was possible when experience and discipline were applied at the highest level. Which was, Sandra thought, about as accurate a description of what was coming as Callahan could have offered. At 9:22, Ryan walked out to the helicopter. The Bell 407 sat at the near end of the flight line, white and clean in the morning light, the Callahan Industries logo on the tail in tasteful blue. The ground crew had completed the pre-flight 2 hours earlier, and Ryan had done his own check on arrival, working the same systematic circuit she'd watched on the western rooftop 8 weeks ago. Tail rotor to main rotor to skids, both hands on the hub. Every surface, every junction assessed, not because he didn't trust the ground crew, but because this was what he did, and what he'd always done, and the habit had outlasted everything else. Cole was in the viewing stand. Sandra had positioned him in the front row, in the care of Callahan's event coordinator, a young man named Paul, who had been briefed that his primary responsibility for the next 40 minutes was to not lose track of the small blonde kid in the yellow aviator glasses. Paul had said he understood. Cole had given Paul a look that suggested Cole was not entirely confident in this arrangement, but was prepared to tolerate it in the interest of the larger operation. Sandra put her headset on. Keyed the mic, Ryan. Radio check. His voice came through immediately. Clear. Close sounding in the way of good equipment, like he was standing next to her, instead of across 200 feet of tarmac. 5 by 5. Frequency is clean. You're clear to proceed when ready. A brief pause. Not hesitation. The pause of a person taking one deliberate breath before doing the thing they came to do. Copy. Starting up, the engine caught. The sound of it moved through Sandra's chest before it registered anywhere else. The deep turbine note, the rotor picking up, the air beginning to respond. She'd grown up around aircraft. She'd heard engines start hundreds of times in dozens of contexts. But something about this specific engine on this specific morning in the November clear air over the Callahan airfield made the sound land differently, like something returning from a long way away. The rotor hit its operating speed. The sound leveled into its working register, the deep, rhythmic authority of a helicopter rotor at full speed, the sound of something large and purposeful doing exactly what it was built to do. Ryan's voice in her headset. Ready? Sandra looked at the helicopter. At the man in the flight suit behind the glass of the cockpit, hands already in position, eyes already on the horizon beyond the field. Your go, she said. The helicopter lifted. And the crowd in the viewing stands went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience managing its attention. The involuntary quiet of people who have stopped performing their own presence because something in front of them has demanded it. It was the quality of the lift. That was what did it, not the fact of a helicopter rising, which every person in those stands had seen before. The quality, the absolute smoothness of it, the complete absence of negotiation between the aircraft and gravity, as though Ryan had simply decided the helicopter would be at a different altitude, and the helicopter had agreed without discussion. No lurch, no visible effort, just up. The way something moved when the person moving it had stopped thinking about the mechanics entirely, and was operating somewhere below conscious decision. 10 feet. 20. 50. He didn't rush the ascent. Didn't perform it. Just brought the aircraft up with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. And at 150 feet he stopped. Held it there. Hover so clean the aircraft might as well have been mounted on an invisible pole, not drifting, not correcting, simply stationary in the November air, as though it had always been there and always would be. He let the crowd understand what they were looking at. Sandra kept her eyes on him. On the aircraft, technically. But through the aircraft at the man inside it. At the quality of attention required to hold a helicopter in stationary hover in variable morning air. The constant micro-adjustments. The continuous conversation between pilot and machine, the way the wind off the hills to the east wanted to push the aircraft south. And Ryan was simply not permitting it. Not fighting it. Not fighting. Just not permitting. 3 years and 4 months. He hadn't done this in 3 years and 4 months. you would not have known. The precision turns came next. 30 degrees, 60, 90, each one executed at a pace that let the audience track the geometry, not slow, but deliberate. Here is the entry. Here is the bank. Here is the rollout at exactly the planned heading. The aircraft moved through each sequence with the quality of something inevitable, as though the flight path had been drawn in the air before Ryan arrived and he was simply tracing it. Sandra heard someone in the viewing stand say something she couldn't make out, a response from whoever was nearby. Then quiet again. The quality of attention that crowds generated when they stopped monitoring their own reactions and started actually watching. The spot turn. Ryan brought the aircraft to hover at the center of the demonstration zone 200 feet above the tarmac, stationary, and then began to rotate. Slowly at first, then steady. The helicopter, turning in place, like a compass needle finding its bearing. 360 degrees. The nose returning to its original heading with the precision of something mechanical rather than human, something that operated without the small imprecisions that human control usually introduced. He held it there for 2 full seconds after the turn completed. Nobody moved in the viewing stands. Then he descended. Not straight down a long diagonal approach line, controlled. The kind of descent that would have been elegant in an aircraft twice the size, and in this context was almost architectural. The aircraft came down the approach path with absolute consistency of angle and rate, and the skids touched the tarmac with a contact so light that the crowd didn't hear it land. They heard the engine beginning to spool down. That was when it broke. The applause started in the viewing stands and built quickly from the polite to the genuine. The sound an audience made when it had expected to be impressed and had been surprised by something it hadn't had a category for. Not the performance of appreciation. The actual thing, unmanaged and real. Cole was already moving. Sandra heard it before she saw it, the small, rapid sound of sneakers on metal bleacher steps, then on tarmac, moving fast and with absolute purpose. She turned and Paul, the event coordinator, was standing in the now empty front row, with an expression that communicated he had tried and been comprehensively outpaced by a determined 5-year-old in yellow aviator glasses. Cole crossed the tarmac at a dead run. Ryan stepped out of the cockpit, and Cole hit him at full speed, both arms up, the full body commitment of a child who had saved this specific greeting for the correct moment and was now deploying it without reservation. Ryan caught him, held him up, and Cole wrapped his arms around his father's neck and said something into his shoulder that was too quiet for Sandra to hear across the tarmac and too private for her to need to hear. Ryan held on, eyes closed, the noise of the crowd somewhere behind them, the engine cooling down with the small metallic sounds of contraction, the morning air moving off the hills, and Ryan Mercer holding his son on a tarmac in November with his eyes closed, and something in his posture that was not the trained stillness of composure, but something more fundamental, the stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and has not yet moved, because moving would mean leaving the moment, and the moment was exactly right. Sandra stood at the flight line. She had made a decision approximately 45 seconds ago when her eyes started doing something. She chose not to acknowledge that she was not going to cry. She had made this decision firmly and with conviction. She did not honor it. 2 tears. Maybe 3. Not performance. Not the released tension weeping of someone who needed to let something out. Just the quiet evidence of a body responding to something true without asking permission first. She blinked, didn't wipe, just let it happen, and then let it be done. Then she noticed George Weston standing in the viewing stands. He was at the far left edge of the back row, standing rather than sitting. He had not been on the guest list Sandra had reviewed, which meant Callahan had extended a separate invitation, or George had arranged it himself through channels he maintained for exactly this kind of purpose. He was watching Ryan and Cole on the tarmac. His hands were in his coat pockets. His face was doing something complicated that she was too far away to read with precision. She looked at her father, then at Ryan and Cole, then back at her father. George Weston was not a man who revised himself quickly. She had known this her entire life. His adjustments were geological, slow, deep, the kind of movement you could only measure in retrospect, because the surface gave no indication while the foundation was shifting. But they were real when they happened. And they were permanent in a way that faster revisions rarely were. Robert Callahan appeared at her elbow, with the timing of a man who had orchestrated something and wanted to confirm it had worked. "Extraordinary," he said, and meant it without qualification. Yes, she meant it too. The scholarship paperwork will go to his address on file by end of week. Callahan watched Ryan set Cole down and crouch to adjust the yellow aviator glasses that had gone sideways in the impact. "I'd still like him for the consulting work. When he's ready. That offer doesn't expire. I'll pass it along." She paused. "He'll decide on his own timeline." Callahan looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of a man calibrating a situation he understood better than he was letting on. "Of course," he said, and moved off to work his crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for 30 years. Sandra turned back to the tarmac. Ryan was walking toward her. Cole had returned to Paul, apparently satisfied with the reunion and now ready to re-engage with the professional responsibilities of ground-based aviation observation. He was pointing at something on the helicopter's tail section and explaining it to Paul with the confident authority of someone who had done considerable independent research on the subject. Ryan stopped in front of Sandra, helmet under his arm, flight suit, the settling sound of the cooling engine behind him. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before, not lighter exactly, not unburdened exactly, more complete. Like a sentence that had been missing a word for 3 years and had finally found it, and now the sentence could be what it was always supposed to be. She said, "You didn't abort." He looked at her. "No. How was it?" He considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. Didn't answer quickly, like remembering something I thought I'd lost. A pause. Except it wasn't lost. It was just waiting. She thought about the February renewal. The certificate maintained through 3 years and 4 months of not using it. The door kept open by something that wasn't hope and wasn't surrender and didn't have a clean name. "Things wait," she said, "when you leave them the right way." Ryan looked at her for a moment. Then George Weston was there. He came across the tarmac with the measured pace of a man approaching a situation he had spent some time thinking about and had decided how to handle. Not aggressive, not conciliatory. The walk of someone who had decided what they wanted to say and was going to say it without theater or preamble. He stopped in front of Ryan. Ryan looked at him. Not wary, not performing ease. Present. The quality he brought to all lect. Direct encounters, the willingness to be exactly where he was, without negotiating the terms of it. George extended his hand. Ryan took it. George's voice was lower than his professional register, stripped of the framework he used in rooms full of people. "I said something to my daughter, weeks ago. About you." He held Ryan's gaze. "I was wrong about what I said. And I want you to know that directly." Ryan didn't fill the space. Didn't deflect or minimize or offer the social smoothing that made this kind of moment easier to get through. George said, A man who gives everything to protect his child, he understands what actually matters. I should have seen that first instead of last." Ryan said, "You're seeing it now, not forgiving, not withholding forgiveness, simply accurate." The statement of a man who had moved past needing an apology and was noting the fact of where they were without making more of it than it was. George turned to Sandra. He looked at his daughter with the expression she had waited a long time to see from him, not the evaluation, not the weekly call face of a man monitoring his investment, not the assessment of whether she was measuring up to something he'd built before she was born. The face of a father who had just watched his child be exactly who she was, in the way she'd chosen to be it, and found arriving later than he should have that he was proud of her. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I came in." Sandra looked at her father for a long moment. "I know," she said, and meant it as acceptance, not dismissal. The closing of something that had been open too long and could now be closed cleanly. George Weston nodded. He found Cole in the crowd, the small figure in the yellow aviator glasses, who was still holding court with Paul near the helicopter, and walked toward him with the gravitational pull of a man who had just decided to add something to his life rather than protect what he already had. Cole looked up at the large, silver-haired man approaching, ran his standard assessment. Then, apparently reaching a positive conclusion, opened his notebook and showed George a drawing. George Weston sat down next to Cole on the bleacher step and looked at the notebook with the seriousness it deserved. Sandra watched this from across the tarmac. She thought about her father calling Callahan from his car. She thought about him sitting in his study in Lake Oswego, looking at that old photograph. She thought about the geological pace of real change and whether it was possible to be impatient with it and grateful for it simultaneously. She decided it was. Ryan found her on the east side of the airfield 40 minutes later. The post-event reception had run its course in the hangar handshakes and business cards, and the professional business of the world resuming its ordinary operations around what had just happened. Sandra had worked the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who could be present for a conversation, while the larger part of her attention was somewhere else entirely. She'd shaken hands with people whose names she wouldn't, and people whose names she wouldn't, and said things that were true and appropriate and required no particular thought. Then she'd stepped outside. The east side of the airfield was away from the main activity, facing the hills. The sun had moved to its midday position. The hills caught the light differently, now less dramatic than the early morning gold. The honest flatness of November noon. The landscape just being itself without performing anything. She heard footsteps behind her, Ryan. Without Cole was inside with Margaret Briggs, who had arrived at some point during the reception carrying a casserole in a canvas bag. Because Margaret Briggs showed up at significant events with casseroles the way other people showed up, with flowers. And it was, Sandra had come to understand, how she expressed that something mattered. Ryan stood next to her, looked out at the hills. They were quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "Weeks ago. About being both things." She waited. "I spent 3 years deciding that being less was the safer position. Less visible. Less exposed to failing at something that mattered." He kept his eyes on the hills. "Except Cole doesn't need me to be less. He needs me to be what I actually am. Whatever that turns out to be, a pilot," Sandra said. Among other things, she turned to look at him. He turned to look at her at almost exactly the same moment, which meant they were suddenly facing each other directly from about 3 feet away, with nothing else available to focus on. He said, "The thing you said on the rooftop." She knew what he was referring to. She'd known this moment was somewhere ahead of them, for weeks had seen it, approaching the way you saw weather coming over the hills. Not the exact arrival, but the certainty of it. She had prepared several possible responses in the abstract, and now, in the actual moment, none of them felt like the right thing to say. So she said the right thing instead. "I know I didn't mean it then." He was quiet. "I'm telling you that I mean it now," she said. "That's different. Those are 2 different statements, and I need you to understand that I know the difference." He looked at her with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, not intense in the performed way, not searching, completely. The feeling of being the only thing in someone's field of vision that was actually registering. "Sandra, don't tell me you need more time to think about it," she said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you that I mean it. The rest is yours to do with what you want." He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was a long time. But not an uncertain time, the pause of a person confirming something they'd already arrived at. making sure the confirmation was going to be the right shape when it came out. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him. And I need you to understand some things." His voice had the care of someone who was being accurate rather than romantic. "I don't move fast on anything. Cole comes first. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, he comes first. That's not negotiable, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'd be worried about you if he didn't, and I'm still working out what the next version of me looks like." He gestured slightly the airfield, himself, everything in between. The pilot thing, the consulting thing. "I can't give you a clean picture of what I am right now because I'm still figuring it out, Ryan." She kept her voice steady, the kind of steadiness that came from meaning what you were saying. "I run a company. I have a father I love who exhausts me. I have a board that requires regular management and a 20-year contract to execute, and a Monday morning call I've been on for 2 years." A pause. "I don't need a clean picture. I've been working in complicated situations my entire professional life. I know how to stay in one." Something shifted in his face, very small. The equivalent, for Ryan Mercer, of a significant outward expression. "Okay," he said. Just that word. And it was, somehow, exactly enough. Not the declaration of something beginning the acknowledgement of something that had already been underway for longer than either of them had been willing to name it. They stood on the east side of the Callahan airfield with the hills in front of them, and the November noon light doing its honest work on the landscape, and nothing resolving into anything neat, and that was all right. That was, in fact, considerably better than neat. The rooftop happened 3 weeks later. It was a Saturday. Not a working Saturday, which was notable, because Sandra's Saturdays had been working Saturdays for 2 years with the reliability of a load-bearing wall. This one she'd left deliberately empty. The way you left a space in a room when you were waiting to understand what belonged in it. She went to the rooftop of Western Aviation at 4:30 in the afternoon. She didn't have a reason she could articulate cleanly. Or she had a reason she hadn't examined closely enough to name yet. She went anyway, the way you went toward things you weren't ready to explain but were ready to do. The elevator to 18, the access door, the rooftop with its equipment and its view and its quality of being above the ordinary operations of the building below. The Bell 407 was there, and Ryan was there, in the late afternoon light, with a cloth and a bucket, cleaning the exterior of the aircraft with the systematic attention he brought to everything. Not because anyone had asked him. Not because it was his shift he'd resigned from the janitorial position 2 weeks ago. The consulting contract with Callahan in progress. The certificate finally being used for the purpose it had been maintained for. He was cleaning the helicopter because the aircraft was being flown again, and he apparently had opinions about how maintained things should be when they were being used properly. He looked up when she came through the door. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The city was below them, Portland in November. Late afternoon, the light going gold and low over the West Hills. The river catching it at an angle that made it look like something a photographer had arranged, and then decided was too obvious, and arranged again differently. The kind of sky that showed up a few times a year and made you feel the complicated gratitude of living in a place that was capable of this. "Old habits," she said. Ryan looked at the cloth in his hand. "The good ones deserve keeping." She walked to the edge and looked out at the city. Behind her, she heard him return to the aircraft, the small sounds of careful work. She stood there for a while, looking at Portland from 18 floors up, and thought about the rooftop, the first time the helicopter waiting, the pilot missing, the impossible situation that had somehow resolved itself by a man in a gray uniform walking out of a stairwell. She turned around. Ryan was cleaning the tail section. He had the concentration of someone who was apparently focused on the aircraft and was actually aware of everything in the space around him, including her, including where she was standing, and how she'd been standing there. "Fly this," she said, quietly, "and I'll marry you." He went still, Not the trained stillness. The other kind, the kind that meant something had landed, and he was letting it land completely before he responded. She waited. He set the cloth down on the edge of the bucket, turned around. He looked at her across the rooftop, with the clear November light between them and his face, doing the thing she'd come to understand as his version of openness. Every layer of the habitual composure present, and something behind all of it visible anyway, visible through it, the way light came through a window even when the glass was thick. "Do you mean it this time?" he said. "More than I've meant anything," she said. In longer than I can measure, he crossed the rooftop toward her, stopped 3 feet away. He didn't have a ring. She hadn't expected one. He didn't kneel. She hadn't expected that either. He had never been a man who expressed himself through formal architecture, through the performance of feeling, rather than the thing itself. He expressed himself through showing up, through the certificate renewed every 2 years at a kitchen table while a child drew at the other end, through the jacket draped exactly right over a sleeping boy, through flying when he said he would fly, and landing when he said he would land, and telling the truth about being scared before he did either. He took her hand. His voice had the quality it had on the ground at the airfield, stripped of everything decorative, just the true thing underneath. "I flew for my country," he said. "Then for Cole. Now I want to fly for both of you if you'll have me," she said. "Yes." He pulled her in, and she went without hesitation, which was, she realized, the first time in 2 years she'd done anything without at least a partial, internal audit of the decision. It felt like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has finally found somewhere safe to set it down. They stood on the rooftop of Western Aviation in the November late afternoon, with the city below them and the sky doing what it did, and no one watching, which was fine, which was exactly right. Some things didn't need an audience to be real. This was one of them. The ventilation unit to their left produced a sound, specifically, the sound of a small person who had been concealing themselves behind it and was now choosing to unconceal themselves. Cole emerged with the practiced nonchalance of someone who was absolutely going to pretend they hadn't been behind a ventilation unit for the past however long. He was carrying flowers, a collection of the small late-season blooms from the decorative planters on the rooftop terrace adjacent to the executive floor, tied together with a lace from his left shoe, which was now flopping loose and untethered with each step he took. He had the yellow aviator glasses on. He held the flowers out to Sandra with the dignity of a small ambassador presenting official credentials. She took them. He looked at his father. "Did you ask yet?" "Yes." "Did she say yes?" "She said yes." Cole absorbed this with the expression of a person receiving information they had anticipated but were professionally required to verify before acting on it. Then he looked at Sandra with the full weight of his assessment. "Are you going to stay?" She looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at her. "Yes," she said to Cole. "I'm going to stay." Cole nodded once. With the gravity of a 5-year-old concluding a negotiation he had been instrumental in bringing to this point. Then he sat down on the rooftop surface with his notebook and opened it to a fresh page and began to draw the helicopter. 3 figures. The sun in the upper right corner, or possibly the moon, though Sandra had decided definitively that it was the sun. Ryan watched his son draw. Sandra stood next to Ryan on the rooftop with the flowers in her hand, the small, imperfect, slightly asymmetrical bouquet tied with a shoelace from a 5-year-old's left shoe, and looked out at Portland, the city that had been her inheritance and her burden and her proof of something for 2 years. It looked different from up here now. Not smaller, not easier. Just more like what it actually was, a place where things happened. A city going about its enormous ordinary business below people who were for a moment above it. Not above it in the way of power or remove, but in the way of altitude. The temporary, honest altitude of people who had climbed somewhere and were looking at things from a new angle before they came back down. She would come back down. She had a company to run, a contract to execute. Mondays with her father, who was not fixed but was shifting, which was more than she'd expected and more than enough. Ryan would come back down too, to Cole's school schedule and the consulting work, still taking shape, and the ongoing project of figuring out what the next version of himself looked like in practice, which had no completion date and didn't need one. But for now they were on the rooftop. And the sky was doing what November skies occasionally did in Portland, deciding briefly to be extraordinary. Cole finished his drawing. He held it up and looked at it himself first, with the evaluating eye of an artist assessing their own work before anyone else got an opinion. 3 figures in the cockpit, the helicopter nose up and climbing. The circle in the upper right corner sending its rays across the page in orange and yellow crayon, the sun. Sandra had decided, definitively the sun. At the bottom, in the deliberate block letters of a child who had recently learned to write and was still proud of each one, taking care with the spacing, the best pilot in the world. Ryan took the drawing, folded it once, carefully, along a clean line that didn't crease any of the figures, put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at Sandra, then at Cole, who had already opened to the next page and begun sketching something new, a helicopter modification that appeared to involve an additional rotor mounted horizontally above the main one, for reasons Cole had not yet explained but clearly found compelling. "He's going to want the school closest to an airfield," Ryan said. "Obviously, I'm going to look at all 3 options before I let him decide. That seems wise. He'll do research." Ryan watched his son draw. "He'll bring me a presentation. He'll bring you a notebook full of drawings and call it a presentation. Same thing." Sandra looked at him sideways. Something in his face that she hadn't seen before, not the absence of weight. Because the weight was structural for him now, and always would be, built into the way he stood and moved and spoke. But something alongside the weight that hadn't been there before. Something that occupied the same space without displacing it. She thought she might not have a word for it yet. She thought she might not need one. "The consulting contract," she said. "Have you looked at it? Read it twice last night and the scope is right. The hours are workable." He paused. "I'm going to say yes." Sandra kept her expression neutral, managed it almost entirely. "That seems like a reasonable decision. It's not about the money. I know. It's about," he stopped, considered, "it's about not disappearing anymore. About Cole seeing me do something instead of just be somewhere." He looked at the helicopter. "He draws pilots. He should see one." Sandra looked at the helicopter too. The Bell 407 in the late afternoon light. Clean from Ryan's attention, the city spread out below, and behind it, "He sees one," she said. "He has for a while." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Cole set down his orange crayon and picked up a blue one. The new drawing was taking shape. The horizontal rotor now had what appeared to be a small cockpit of its own, suggesting that Cole had invented a helicopter with a secondary piloting position on top of it, for reasons that were probably going to be explained at length over dinner. "Miss Maggie is taking him to his first day," Ryan said, "when school starts. I asked her." Sandra looked at him. "You asked her?" "She said yes before I finished the sentence." He paused. "She's been waiting for a reason to do something like that." Sandra thought about Margaret Briggs, about the casserole at the airfield, about the emergency contact entry in the HR system, about what it meant to be the mother of someone who'd been hurt by a decision that couldn't have gone any other way, and to still choose deliberately to become part of the life of the man who'd made it, about the specific shape of grace that required, and what it said about the person capable of it. "She's good people," Sandra said. "The best I know," Ryan said it simply, without qualification. "She never asked me to feel better about what happened. She just kept showing up." Sandra thought about this for a while. She thought about the different ways people showed up, the loud ways and the quiet ways, the casserole ways and the headset on a flight line ways, the ways that announced themselves and the ways that didn't. She thought about what it meant to be someone who showed up, whether she was that person, whether she was becoming that person, whether those were the same question or two different ones. She thought she might ask Ryan about it sometime. Not today. Sometime when there was more space around the question. Cole held up the new drawing without looking away from it. "This one is for Miss Maggie," he announced, "because she drives me places." Ryan looked at the drawing. The horizontal rotor, the secondary cockpit, the level of aeronautical ambition compressed into a single page of spiral-bound notebook paper. "She'll love it," he said. Cole accepted this assessment and returned to adding detail to the secondary cockpit, which appeared to be acquiring instrument panels. The sun moved lower over the West Hills. The city below shifted into its early evening configuration, the office lights coming on in towers across the river, the bridges beginning to glow, the Willamette going from gray to the particular dark silver it became when the day was leaving. And the night hadn't fully arrived yet. Sandra looked at all of it, then at Ryan, then at Cole, who was now adding what appeared to be a third cockpit somewhere near the tail, which raised structural questions that she decided were Cole's to resolve. "Where to?" Ryan asked, the question from the airfield, from every flight. From the rooftop. The rooftop 8 weeks ago when he'd first sat in the pilot's seat, and the engine had caught, and Portland had spread out below them, and everything had been different from that moment forward, even though neither of them had known it yet. She looked at the helicopter, at the city, at Cole now lying on his back on the rooftop surface, looking up at the November sky with the total openness of a child who has nowhere else to be and no reason to be anywhere else, and finds this completely satisfactory. "Anywhere, she said. "As long as we're going together." Ryan looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention. Then he picked up the cloth from the edge of the bucket. Finished the last section of the tail he'd been cleaning before she arrived. Set the cloth down with the finality of someone completing a task properly rather than just stopping it. Held his hand out. She took it. 6 months later, the three of them flew on Saturday mornings. Not always. Sometimes Cole had a school thing. Sometimes Sandra had a call she couldn't move. Sometimes Ryan had an early site visit to the Callahan facility south of the city, where the simulator training program was taking shape under his technical direction. But when the week allowed it, and the weather cooperated and nothing intruded, Saturday mornings belonged to the air. Cole's school was the one on the north side of the city, 12 minutes from the apartment on Southeast Hawthorne. Not the closest to an airfield that had been Cole's first choice, argued for with a thoroughness that Ryan had described to Sandra afterward as genuinely impressive, but the one with the science program that had made Cole go quiet for 3 full minutes when he read about it, which Ryan had learned was Cole's version of being overwhelmed by wanting something. Cole had presented his case for the airfield school. Ryan had listened to the entire presentation, which did in fact involve the notebook and was in fact more rigorous than most presentations Sandra sat through in boardrooms. Then Ryan had shown Cole the science program at the other school, and Cole had gone quiet for 3 minutes. And that had been that. Margaret Briggs drove him on the first day. Ryan stood at the curb and watched her blue Ford turn the corner, Cole's face visible in the passenger window until the last moment, not anxious, not performing bravery, just watching the street go by with the focused attention of someone taking careful inventory of a new thing. Ryan stood at the curb after the car was gone, for longer than was strictly necessary there. He was thinking, he told Sandra later, about the fact that Grace arrived in shapes you hadn't anticipated. That Margaret Briggs had looked up at him in a physical therapy waiting room when he wasn't sure he deserved to be looked at, and had said, "Thomas talks about you," and that this had set in motion a chain of things that had led to her driving his son to his first day of school, while Ryan stood on a sidewalk in Southeast Portland, feeling something he didn't have a precise word for. Grateful, maybe, but larger than grateful. The word for gratitude that had been earned through something difficult and was understood to be rare. Tommy Briggs came to the airfield one Saturday in February. He came in a modified van, the kind fitted for wheelchair access, driven by a friend from the VA center. Ryan had asked him quietly whether he wanted to come out sometime and see what the consulting work looked like in practice. Tommy had said maybe, and then a few weeks later had said yes, and here he was 29 years old, Medford kid, the ferocity with which he was rebuilding his life visible in the way he moved through the world, using everything available to him and not spending energy on what wasn't. Cole spent 45 minutes explaining his helicopter drawings to Tommy with the concentrated enthusiasm of someone who has found an audience capable of appreciating the full scope of his technical vision. Tommy listened to all of it, asked 2 questions that were so specific and accurate that Cole looked at him with the expression of someone encountering a serious peer for the first time. Ryan watched this from across the hangar. Sandra stood next to him. She didn't say anything. She understood, from the quality of his stillness, that this was a moment that required witnessing rather than commentary. After a while, Ryan said, "He wanted to fly since he was 7. I know," Sandra said. She'd read the article enough times to have it. "He's not done figuring out what that means now." A pause. "He told me that. Last month." "What did you say?" "I said neither was I." Ryan kept his eyes on Tommy and Cole. "He said that was probably the most useful thing I'd ever told him." Sandra looked at the 2 of them, the 29-year-old in the wheelchair and the 5-year-old with the notebook, conducting what appeared to be a highly technical discussion about rotor configurations in the middle of a hangar on a Saturday morning in February. She thought, this is what it looks like when people stay. Not the dramatic version, not the version with a clean resolution and everyone exactly healed. The real version, complicated and ongoing and full of things that hadn't been figured out yet, and people who were still in the process of becoming whoever they were going to be. The version where Grace showed up in casseroles and yellow aviator glasses, and a stranger in a waiting room who said, "Sit down. You're not in trouble." George Weston came to dinner on the first Sunday of the month. This had become, by the time February arrived, a thing that simply happened rather than a thing that had been decided. He drove in from Lake Oswego, parked in the street outside the apartment on Southeast Hawthorne, and ate at the small table in the kitchen, where Cole held court from his regular chair with whatever he was currently most interested in at present, a school project about weather systems that had expanded considerably beyond its original scope. George and Ryan were not easy with each other. That was the honest assessment. They were 2 men who had started from a position of mutual suspicion and were building something more careful in its place, which took time and required both of them to keep showing up for dinners, where the conversation sometimes ran dry and one of them said something clumsy and they worked around it and moved on. But they kept showing up. Cole helped. Cole helped with everything simply by being himself, by treating every person at the table as someone worth explaining his current obsession to, which was, Sandra had come to understand, the highest form of acceptance available from a 5-year-old. One evening, in March, Cole put his fork down mid-dinner and looked at George with the directness that was his most consistent quality. "Do you know my dad is the best pilot in the world?" he asked. George looked across the table at Ryan. Ryan was looking at his plate with the expression of a man who has heard this assessment before and has not yet worked out whether he's supposed to argue with it or not. George said, "I know." Cole nodded, satisfied, and picked his fork back up. Ryan didn't look up from his plate for another moment. When he did, he looked at Sandra rather than at George. And Sandra, who had been watching, saw in his face the thing she'd been watching develop over months, not the absence of the weight he carried, because the weight was his and permanent and real, but something else occupying the same space. Something that had learned to coexist with the weight rather than fight it. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone starts to trust that the ground will hold. Not certainty. Not the end of the 4 o'clock mornings or the dreams that brought him to simulator rooms in the middle of the night. not the resolution of the thing between him and the decision he'd made in the dark over a compromised position with Tommy Briggs beside him. Those were not going to resolve. They were going to become part of the landscape, which was different from resolving and possibly more honest, but trust. The beginning of it. The willingness to let something matter again, knowing mattering came with the risk of loss, and choosing to do it anyway, because the alternative, the grey uniform, the invisible years, the certificate renewed and never used, was its own kind of loss, slower and quieter and harder to name but real. On the last Saturday of March, the three of them flew east, Cole's suggestion. He'd been studying weather systems for his school project and had read about the high desert east of the Cascades, and how the sky there was different from the sky over Portland. Bigger, he said. Les interrupted. He wanted to see it from above. Ryan filed the flight plan on Friday night. Sandra packed a bag with snacks and Cole's notebook and the yellow aviator glasses. The morning was clear, the kind of clear that the high desert made possible even in March, the air dry and bright and expansive. They lifted off from the Western Aviation rooftop at 8 o'clock. Portland fell away below them, the grid of it. The river, the bridges, the West Hills going green with early spring. Ryan banked east, and the city gave way to the suburbs, and then to the smaller towns along the Columbia, and then to the foothills, and then to the mountains themselves. The Cascades running north to south in their white and an ancient row. Cole had his face against the window. He didn't say anything for a long time, just looked. His notebook was open on his knee, but he wasn't drawing, he was watching, taking the wide inventory of a child encountering something slapping that was larger than he'd expected, and was going to require a lot of looking before he'd begin to draw it. Ryan flew through the pass, and the landscape changed on the other side. The green fell away, and the country opened up brown and gold and enormous. The sky above it doing exactly what Cole had said it would do. Bigger, Les interrupted. The kind of sky that made you understand, physically, that you were very small and the world was very large, and both of those things were fine. Sandra looked at Ryan. He was looking at the horizon, at the sky that went on, past what you could see. At the high desert spreading out below them with its honest colors and its complete indifference to the smallness of the aircraft moving through the air above it. His hands were easy on the controls. Not loose. Ryan's hands were never entirely loose, the attention never entirely absent, but easy, the ease of a person who has returned to something they were built for and has stopped being surprised by how natural it feels. She thought about the rooftop in October, the helicopter waiting, blades, still, no one to fly it. The man who walked out of a stairwell, carrying a mop and said 3 words without theater, and set a chain of things in motion that neither of them had predicted or planned or had any right to expect would end up at 32,000 feet east of Portland, on a Saturday in March, with a 5-year-old with his face against the window and the high desert below, and the sky going on past the edge of what was visible. She thought about the things that waited when you left them the right way. The certificates and the doors and the people and the versions of yourself you hadn't entirely given up on, even when you'd stopped asking about them. She thought about ground support. About what it meant to be the fixed point someone flew back toward. About the fact that she had been the person in motion her entire professional life and was learning. Slowly and not without difficulty, that being the fixed point was not the smaller job. That it required its own kind of courage. That standing still for someone else's flight was not the same as standing still. Cole finally picked up his crayon. He drew for 15 minutes, without looking up, concentrated, private, the work of someone who had been patient long enough and now knew exactly what they needed to put on paper. Then he held the notebook up. The drawing was larger than his usual ones. He'd used 2 full pages spread open, the largest canvas available to him. The high desert below, indicated in brown and gold crayon. The mountains behind them, indicated in white and gray. And above it all, the helicopter, 3 figures visible through the cockpit window. identifiable by their specific details. The pilot with the straight posture, the woman in the dark jacket, the small figure in the back with the yellow circles on his face. The helicopter was flying toward the right side of the page, toward where the drawing ended, toward whatever was past the edge. At the bottom, in the careful block letters, Cole had written 2 words, skill flying. Ryan reached back without taking his eyes off the horizon. Cole put the drawing in his hand. Ryan looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it, once along a clean line, and put it in his jacket pocket with the other one with the best pilot in the world from November. Kept there through months of flights and dinners and Sunday evenings and 4 o'clock mornings and everything in between. He looked at Sandra, she looked at him. Where to? He said. She looked at the sky, at the desert below. At Cole already opening to a fresh page in his notebook, already beginning something new, already moving toward the next thing with the unstoppable forward motion of a child who had decided the world was worth the attention. Keep going east, she said. Ryan looked back at the horizon, and the helicopter flew on into the enormous ordinary sky, carrying the 3 of them toward whatever came next, not knowing what it was, not needing to know, trusting the instruments and the air, and the person beside you, and the small voice from the back seat that was already asking questions about what was on the other side of the next range of hills, which was, in the end, the only way anyone ever got anywhere worth going, still flying.